Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Hacker Noon podcast. Today we are with Noonies nominee Nataraj Sindam. Nataraj is a Microsoft engineer, entrepreneur, and podcast creator, and he is nominated as Hacker Noon Contributor of the Year for Business Strategy. How's it going, Nataraj? Thanks very much for joining us today.
Hey, Limarc, it's going good. Pleasure to be here with you today, and always happy to be part of anything Hacker Noon does. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm a fan of yours, actually, and I've read your articles, but some of our listeners today might not be so familiar with you. Could you please briefly tell us about your career history and how you ended up working at Microsoft?
So describing or identifying yourself as something is a little bit more tricky. But as a conventional wisdom goes, everyone identifies themselves with their full-time job. So I'll identify myself with the full-time job I do, which is I'm an engineer at Microsoft, and I basically work in Microsoft Azure team on developing cloud applications. Before that, I worked for a healthcare software company called Epic Systems, and I'm a graduate in computer science and mathematics. I'm also an entrepreneur and investor. And full disclosure to the audience that I'm one of the investors in Hacker Noon's crowdfunding campaign. So
yeah. You said that conventionally, most people identify themselves with their full-time job. How would you identify yourself other than that? What do you think is the better way, or what way do you prefer to identify yourself?
I think everyone has a range of identities. I mean, I would think of myself as more of a generalist because the term engineer is very specific. But I like to think of myself as wearing multiple hats because, as I said, I am a creator. I think myself as a creator. I like ideating new things. Yes. I love the process of creating something from nothing. So I look at writing even code as creating from something. That's today the most effective form of creating anything.
Yeah.
And so an artist will think of himself as, creating something out of nothing through color. An engineer can think of it using code, and an investor can think of it through capital. And a product developer is you thinking it in terms of developing a product. So the core of it, I think of myself as someone who enjoys creating things.
For sure. Working for Microsoft, that's a huge accomplishment. For engineers, do you kind of follow that same pattern where they identify themselves by the biggest company name they've worked for in the past?
That's a very fascinating question, right? I think I would split that question I would put that question in a different way. Today, I think any career you can look at it in two terms, either linear or non-linear. What do I mean by that? So if you're a developer, you went to college for computer science, you did your own graduation, and maybe you did a master's, and then you joined a software company, you went through the interview loop, and then you gained some couple of experience working with the production code, and then you move on to your next company because you've become a better engineer because of that experience, and so on and so on. So even as a writer or whatever career that you see around us, it's basically this process of linearly jumping, and there's an assumed process, right? If you are a journalist, you work editor room for some time, and then you graduate onto doing bigger and better things. So there's always a linear version of it, and there's a non-linear version of it. And if you see greatest successes or greatest creations or greatest products, those always follow a non-linear path in this linear trajectory. So what do I mean by that is you often see like most creative outcomes come from non-linear paths. Most successful entrepreneurs are not who go to the college and follow a linear path. I'm not saying one is good or one is bad, but it's a combination of both. And these non-linear effects, even as a journalist or writer yourself, if your biggest accomplishment might seem as a non-linear thing, even though you are doing something linear.
100%.
Am I making sense?
No, you're definitely making sense. Like we're linear beings, so we just always tend to put our lives in a linear form whenever we tell a story. But I agree with you where the things that happen in your life, the biggest things probably aren't so linear when you look back at it. So thanks for that. You already talked about your current role at Microsoft. So outside of Microsoft, then, what's one of the biggest projects you're working on now?
Recently worked on a product called the Dosa Shop, which is an e-commerce website, and I should say I'm a failed entrepreneur with that with that respect, because we couldn't find a product market fit. Our original thesis was to serve the Indian community living in the US and in North America.
Yeah.
But turns out they're not, the products that we actually put out there were not being bought by Indians in the US. So right now we are wrapping up that project and probably I'm looking to find the next side project that I want to work on. But apart from that, yeah, I've also done a podcast where I break down business strategy of different sectors, like for example, food delivery. And we've had an episode on WeWork because while we were developing this podcast, WeWork was in the midst of news and everyone was interested. And I wanted to give my take on what's happening around WeWork. And we've covered different other topics.
Cool. Yeah, well, I wouldn't call yourself a failed entrepreneur just yet. I think most of the successful ones, they never had a big hit idea in the first few ideas, right? It's very rare where the first idea is the big hit idea.
That's true. It's also a part of honing your skills. So even I don't consider it as a failure. It's a very good learning lesson, and we learned a lot of lessons in terms of social media marketing and what is the right cost at which you can sell a product and what cost doesn't make sense to sell a product.
Definitely.
So there are a lot of learning lessons, and we realized that the marketing spend that we are doing doesn't make sense in the longer term, and then we decided to change strategy. And right now we're figuring out in the middle whether to continue it or maybe pivot to some different direction.
Nice. Well, I wish you the best of luck in whatever direction you move in next. So I'm sure everyone who's been following the story by now knows the main reason Hacker Noon left Medium is we're quite against paywalls to read stories. And personally, as a writer, I feel the same way. It's quite annoying for me when I see a cool headline, I click on it, then I see you've reached your 5-story limit this week sort of thing, right? What's your opinion on paywall systems? Not just on Medium, you can talk about other blogs that may have them.
I mean, I think there's no one star. There's no one solution to this problem, right? Because we are in this age where anyone can write anything. The problem we are encountering as a society is, how to differentiate between what is a fact and not.
Yeah.
And paywall can solve that problem to an extent, but as we have seen, there is a counterintuitive fact that is flowing around for free. So how do you solve that? So I don't know the answer, and I don't think anyone does yet. And it's a very complicated issue. But yeah, I mean, as a personal user, you are definitely annoyed with having a paywall. But I think at some point we have to get used to the fact that we have to pay for content because we are paying. I think this happened with media in general, right? Like there was a point of time you're watching movies from torrents because there was no Netflix, right? There was no streaming service where they made it easy to access content online. I think we need to get more comfortable. And personally, I am more inclined towards micro payments, so article-based payments, than actually having a subscription. Because let's say I'm interested in a particular article, I want to pay for just that article on New York Times or Washington Post instead of paying for a subscription. But I also realized that incurs, instability in the business that they are running, whether if you're New York Times or Washington Post. You have a staff, you have, your fixed costs, variable costs, and
of course,
it is for them hard to manage. But I think there is a version of payments that we can hit where I would argue that their paying customers would increase if they also introduce a micro payments option, let's say a $1 an article or a 75-cent article, because I'm not a subscriber per se to Washington Post, but now and then I encounter an article or so which I'm really interested in, and then they ask me for $10. Instead, if they ask me for $1, and if the browser payment system is very well integrated, then I can see myself paying for it. So for example, like how Honey, the Chrome plugin, operates today. I mean, imagine Honey facilitating a micro payment option for New York Times or Washington Post, and I should just only pay for that article. I mean,
Yeah.
the technology is there. It's just a matter of strategy, whether or not we want to do it.
I agree. If it gets as simple as I get to click one button and give $1 to this writer, I could see that taking off, you know?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of my writing process, the way I think about my writing process is, for every article I write, I have like 8 drafts that I don't write, I never publish. So I actually have like above 100 of drafts that I never actually published.
Wow.
And for each article, the way I think of an article, so I am a mathematics student, and I did masters in mathematics.
Uh-huh.
And when you do masters in mathematics, what you essentially end up doing is proving a lot of theorems.
Yes.
So you start with the hypothesis, you take the hypothesis, you have a bunch of axioms that you can use, and you finally drive your point through logical reasoning to a conclusion, and you prove your hypothesis. So my articles are mostly based on a theorem structure. I always have a ending one-liner hypothesis that I want to get to, and I am using certain axioms that I believe make sense logically, and I try to derive to that one particular conclusion that I'm trying to tell using that article. So this is something is very fascinating to me, how a theorem and an article look alike for me.
Yes.
And yeah, proving theorems was one of my strong strengths. Weirdly, that turned out to be one of my strong strengths. After doing maths, I realized that, okay, I'm really good at proving theorems. And the way I think about writing is also like proving theorems.
I think that's an incredibly interesting metaphor for the writing process.
Yeah, but I also believe in the concept of flow, where you're not, making the process very mathematical or full of rules. I think that's sometimes also hindering, because a lot of my articles are like a burst of thought that came in the middle of the night or sometime while I was driving, and I just put it down, and my first draft is pretty fast, and then I keep iterating over them and create multiple drafts, and finally I publish things. So, but to get to that first draft, it's not always based on a strictly mathematical approach. Sometimes you have to let it go, and you just start writing, and then again you come back to draft it and edit it and give it a little bit more structure. And
sure.
then I think you can use different structures, but this is the one which really helps me.
For sure. And interestingly, earlier you were talking about how the payment structure for content these days. And one of my favorite articles of yours was about the freemium model. So you published this on Hacker Noon, and it was called The Freemium Model's Reciprocation Effect. I don't want you to go into too much detail, just because it'll take you a while to talk about the entire article, but could you briefly tell our listeners what that was about?
So today, freemium is pretty synonymous with subscriptions, right? We are in the world of subscriptions. We are subscribing everything, Netflix, to whatever you're watching, to whatever you're listening, to whatever you're working on, whether it's a software that you want to use, whether it's Canva, or whether if you want to edit a podcast on Descript, you are basically subscribing.
Yeah.
But before we subscribe to any of those, we actually are given a free version of the software to use without any charge. And this phenomenon has become main go-to-market strategies for all kinds of software services today.
Yes.
And I think there's a deep psychological effect why freemium models actually are very effective in acquiring customers in any line of product. And it is very deeply psychologically rooted. And this is something called as reciprocation effect. What it means essentially is, let's say I, Nataraj, give you Limarc a gift, right? And what it says, the reciprocation effect essentially says that you feel indebted to me in some way.
Yes.
To return that favor. So what happens in freemium model is, let's say when Netflix is giving us a 1 month or a 2 month free subscription, you're psychologically feeling an indebtedness towards Netflix as a company. And if you like the product, you are more likely to subscribe to it for a product which is giving you freemium versus for a product which doesn't give you freemium.
Yes.
And obviously, this is not just the one reason, but it is such a driving and such an overtly psychological reason that, and we see this effect in a lot of places. I mean, this is one of those psychological shortcuts that we often take as human beings, because we
Yep.
develop these shortcuts over time, which will help us in your rapid decision. This also helps, marketing folks and go to market theorists and customer acquisition teams to think about how can we use these psychological effects to actually better acquire customers. And the idea originally for this reciprocation effect came from a book called Influenced by Robert Cialdini. And I would suggest, if anyone who's into product development or marketing, if anyone is curious about psychology, they should read Influenced by Robert Cialdini. And
Cool.
That's where the original idea came. And that's when the aha moment came. Model is such a big hit.
Yeah, and there's also a business aspect to it now, because freemium has become so commonplace that weirdly it's more professional to have a freemium version than not to. And I think one of the reasons for that is, if a company is confident enough in their product that it's really good and they're willing to give it away for free for a short period of time or whatever, it shows that they have so much confidence that either you're going to buy it after, or you're going to keep using it somehow, or you're going to pay for it in some form. Oppositely, if you have a product, like you said, that wasn't freemium, people might be more reticent to even try it, because you have to pay to try it, and if you don't like it in the end, you wasted your money, right?
Yeah. I mean, definitely the advantage with freemium, and I've obviously pointed this in my article, is that the customer can try out the product first before paying. That's a big aspect, because that's a must before the customer can make a decision.
Yeah.
But obviously the psychological effect is also plays a significant role.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right.
And the psychological effect, I think, is really strong. Like one of the examples you used in your article was Fortnite, which I played way too much time on. And I think for the teenagers or even the adults that play Fortnite, what happens is, after they played for a few months, they think, oh, I've played this game for 100 hours for free. Normally I would pay $80 for such a game. Why don't I pay $10 to buy this little skin for my character? And they keep having that psychological effect in their mind, and sooner or later they ended up spending $200 on the game. So in some sense, freemium could get your company more money than you originally would, giving the product away at a set cost.
Yeah, I see this trend growing, because there's a slight difference in model, right? Like there's an evolution in freemium model itself. Like previously, let's say you take the example of Netflix. You either, after using your free service, you are becoming a payment service, or you're not using the service.
Yes.
But there are side of the products into which Fortnite falls, is where you have a free version of product you continuously use, which is resulting in these microtransactions within the platform or the service, which is actually generating probably more revenue than a subscription would actually generate. And
exactly,
I think Fortnite is a perfect example for that. And you can also see this in Canva. They have the free version, but if you wanted to slightly differentiate your design and bring that extra edge to your design, you have to buy the components that make up the design. And then you feel like wondering, why do I buy 5 components? Instead, I pay $10 and take the premium version. So
exactly,
it is also a way to promote the premium version of your product.
Definitely. And I think you're talking about Netflix there. That's a great segue into the next article of yours that I really like. It's called The Obvious Flaw in Recommendation Systems. Could you also briefly tell our listeners what that one is about?
Yeah, actually, this is my favorite article if I consider all the 20 or 30 blog posts that I've written. And the essential point I was driving to make here is we as a society have become a push society. That means we're always pushed some product by some recommendation algorithm, right? I mean, Amazon is suggesting you the product based on the history of products you've bought. Netflix is suggesting you based on what you've watched before, or based on what others have watched who are similar to you, which is essentially what collaborative filtering is. doing, and it's evolving over time, obviously. But Netflix is suggesting what movie you should watch. So Spotify is suggesting what music you should listen, and
Yeah.
it's already making you a playlist, and it's pretty damn accurate too. But the problem I had with the whole version of pushing something
Yep.
is I think we are all reduced into a group personality rather than individual personalities. And we see this behavior of herd mentality, which is slightly negative in connotation, and I don't completely mean it in a negative sense. But we are in the world where everything is pushed to us instead of we going and finding and exploring and stumbling upon interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
And thereby what happens is, I think we as individuals are not growing fully or not evolving fully, or we are not becoming the best of ourselves that we could otherwise be.
I
and
see.
and in this article I also talk about choosing to find a pull life, where I will not watch what Netflix recommends me. I would like think about my interest areas, and I will explore what I want to watch. I would explore what I want to listen. I would not listen deliberately that Spotify suggests, but I will let some other form dictate. Like, let's say I've heard some music while I was traveling in the Uber and I
Yeah.
liked it. I will listen to that. But obviously, all these judgmental heuristics we've developed, or on which the recommendation systems are itself based, are shortcuts that serve a purpose. We can't deny that they don't serve any purpose,
For
because
sure.
after a certain point, it becomes too much. And this is my own personal journey of finding, for example, what book next to read, right? That's the question actually, which drove me to write this article, and
Oh,
it
really?
became into a much bigger issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you see, everyone is reading, like, at any given point, even serious readers or majority readers are reading the same couple of books,
Yeah.
which was kind of fascinating to me. And then I was thinking about myself and what I was reading, and that gave me the idea for the article itself.
Yeah.
And like watching my friends and watching others that I know who are reading books, and how their behavior is actually influenced by social media or recommendation
For sure.
algorithms.
So one point you mentioned there is obviously that the recommendation systems are good in some sense. Obviously, I do like it when Netflix puts the 20 shows that I'm most likely to like at the top of my feed. But is your problem with the push life that in the future you see this sort of dystopian society that never searches for things on their own and everything is pushed in their face? And is what you're worried about the fact that the growth of a more push society would create not only a herd mentality, but people that are easy to be controlled?
I wouldn't. I mean, I haven't thought about people would be controlled to a
Mm-hmm.
level where people would be controlled, but you can see it already happening in a sense that, I mean, I saw it in my own behavior. If Netflix puts its new release on a Friday night on your friend page,
Yeah.
you're most likely to watch it,
Mm.
especially in the pandemic we are. Netflix suggestion is going to drive what movie you're going to end up watching in this weekend.
Yeah, most likely. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and it adds up to the strength of Netflix. And I think eventually we'll reach a point where we want to say that, hey, I want to switch off all the recommendation systems. I think we would get, I think at least I personally feel that there should be options in certain products where I'm not recommended anything. And I completely realize there should be a level of choice whether we want to get recommended stuff or not.
I agree.
Because that's also probably, it devises what thought process and what we evolve into, what choices we eventually make are driven by these recommendations.
Yeah. If you think about it, the entire world in a way is now being formed or molded by recommendation systems, the biggest one of which is Google. The world wasn't like this 20 years ago. If I wanted to find the best dry cleaning service in my city, I might have to ask my family and friends what they use, or I might have to actually go around my town and see what's the closest one. But these days, all I have to do is type in dry cleaning service, and then I'm recommended some by Google. And most people don't know why Google chooses these. We just trust it blindly, right? And I do have a bit of a fear that if this trend keeps going more and more, we're at the mercy of whoever owns the biggest search engine, which is Google. And so far, lots of people have opinions on this, but Google hasn't been too bad. But if Google were taken over by someone with malicious intent, it would be very easy for them, I think, to mold the world in the way they wanted it to.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dichotomy of this decision, right? Like, because you essentially, as a customer, you got the best result. At least, the problem that you're looking for is solved. But think about it in the perspective of the business operator. Maybe he's not in the advantage of receiving the best treatment from Google, right?
That's true.
And some individuals can actually manipulate with search results and maybe push one result up, and maybe Google has the power of push something up and push something down, but I don't think they do it actively in different sectors. But we have seen this happen famously with travel sector when Google launched its own flight service, and I think it's in Europe where one of the companies' traffic was significantly, almost 50 to 60% down. And there's a big legal issue that I don't know if it's concluded yet or not, that happened in Europe about this exact issue.
So in the article, you said Facebook has been the Uber of 2018. They had a negative breaking headline every other week centered around issues of privacy, social engineering, and national security. The reason for this is the decade-long dissemination of content without any regulation under the legal construct for a platform. So Facebook identifies itself as a social media platform, right? And the point you're making is, since it's not a traditional media platform like CNN, they aren't really held to the truth of what people post on Facebook. And Facebook as well functions with recommendation systems. The things you see on your feed, it depends on what you like, what your interests are, and who you're friends with. I wanted to get your opinion on this, Nataraj. Do you think that Facebook is doing the right thing and allowing free speech and letting people post whatever they want? Or do you think in the long run, there might be a negative effect to the fact that anyone and everyone can post anything on Facebook, whether it's true or not, as long as it's not hate speech and as long as it doesn't have a call to violence?
I think fundamentally, Facebook has a choice, right? Facebook is a private business. It has a choice on what it can do. I know it's a very contentious point, and free speech, it comes into whether or not we are allowing free speech or not. But the real point is, it's a private business, and a private business can have restrictions on what content it's serving. So in that sense, as a business itself, Facebook can restrict the content that is being posted on their website. So that's a straight up choice that Facebook has. But obviously they've chosen, and I don't know we shouldn't say it's Facebook, but it came down to being a free speech issue, which is fair, because if that is the only medium out there, it would become synonymous to free speech, because there's no other platform where anyone can go and it could have the same reach as Facebook has.
For sure.
At some point, I think there would be a legal intervention, where either Facebook will be categorized as a media company, which should stick to the guidelines of being a media company. I think that's the direction I see it happening. Whether or not Facebook is doing the right thing or wrong thing, I think it's a very tough call. And it's a tough position to be in, whoever is managing Facebook.
For sure.
But I think they definitely have a choice to make, and they can make the choice without thinking of it as a free speech issue, because at the end of the day, it's a private business controlled by private individuals for a profit mechanism.
For sure.
So in that sense, they have a pure choice on what should be posted on their website and what should not be posted on their website. And I think that's always not heavily represented on the narrative around Facebook, that it's a private business. Like anything, they can control what is being posted, just like CNN does, or Fox News does, or MSNBC does.
I completely agree with that. And to end things off there, talking about the push versus pull life again, obviously in the article you advocate for a more pull life. What's your advice to people that do want to transition to a more pull life? What do you do in your personal life, Nataraj, where you make conscious decisions to make choices on your own rather than get these recommendations pushed onto you?
Firstly, the reason I haven't given a much more articulate answer for Facebook is I'm out of Facebook since I think almost 4 years.
Oh,
I
really?
don't use Facebook. Yeah. I use Facebook Messenger sometimes. At least I keep it open, so anyone who wants to reach me from my childhood or old days can reach me.
Good.
But otherwise, I actually am inactive on Facebook, but I'm active on Twitter and WhatsApp, and I'm not against Facebook or anything. It's just that it doesn't really serve any purpose to me today, other than if you're a other than you're a small business owner, then you have to be on Facebook,
Yeah.
right? Because I personally,
100%.
when I started the dosa shop, I mean, we were doing Facebook marketing, and it's an incredibly useful tool.
Yeah.
And you have to be there because everyone is there.
Definitely.
But as on a personal side of things, I don't use Facebook because I can connect to everyone who I want to connect through WhatsApp or any other, through text message. And another thing is I don't use YouTube recommendations. I mean, I don't allow them to track my viewing history. And you can see the pattern basically wherever there's an option to stop these not just recommendation systems in general, but in terms of where I want a little bit of surprise to be there.
Yeah.
I want to find new things. So
to be honest,
YouTube,
I didn't even know that you could stop YouTube from tracking your viewing history. There's a setting where you can do that.
Yeah, you can stop tracking your viewing history. Then your recommendations you still recommended stuff because YouTube has to populate your friend page.
Yeah.
But then you get a little bit of surprise. The surprise is also based on because they want you to watch the video on the front page.
Yeah.
They are basing it out on logically what makes sense, which is heavily watched video, for example, trending page, or based on the trending or upcoming creators and so on.
For sure.
And my major point when I started this article was about reading, because everyone was reading the same thing. I stopped looking for recommendations of books from sources that are usually prescribed. So I like to think that in terms of books, I never read the books that are released in this year or past 2 years, unless it's like highly recommended in the sense that I prescribe to certain individuals and I believe in certain individuals' recommendations versus media recommending something. And I trust those sources. So I have my own trusted sources, which I think are better than what is being recommended. And otherwise, I think in general, if you're reading books, my point of view is that you always read older and popular books. That's better than newer and popular. So I tend to think of that, okay, this book, I'm like 3 or 4 years behind the release cycle of a book, and let the book age for a bit. And if it survives, then I think it would become a good book eventually.
Cool. Very interesting. So Nataraj, aside from writing, you also do a regular podcast called the End to End Podcast. Could you tell our listeners here why you started that podcast?
Sure. So I did a podcast starting last year, October. It's called End to End. The idea was to cover different sectors of technology businesses end to end, and that's why the name End to End. Only later I realized that there's a common name used by a lot of other podcasts. So it became a real problem in the search engine optimization. But the story behind it is slightly cliched. Me and a bunch of other friends, we went on a barbecue, I think last summer, and I was discussing with one of my friends that I was actually impatient about doing some project outside work, and I was thinking about what I can do in my part-time that can really explore my interest in tech, in my interest in reading books. And I was reading all these books and I was accumulating knowledge, and I was following all sorts of different technologies and businesses, and I was trying to productize all these moving parts into one thing. And I realized I was also a heavy consumer of podcasts, like starting, I don't think 2017. And I realized that maybe doing a podcast could be a a really good way of to productize all this knowledge that I'm been accumulating, and also put all the knowledge in a structural format. And it also trying to force myself to think better of how to think about a particular industry and how to think about business strategy in general. And my curiosity at that time was guiding towards reading about different business strategies in different areas of businesses. And then I thought it would be a really good exercise and also a personal challenge to actually productize it into a podcast. And then I suggested my friend that, hey, we can do this, and he said, yeah, we should do it. And we basically made, after that, every Saturday is a podcasting day, and we decided on some topics, and we made like 10 episodes on different businesses and different strategies. I edited, recorded it, and used a bunch of tools. I initially tried a bunch of tools and failed in them, and find really good tools. And during this process, I also saw podcasting as an industry also growing a lot, and it gave me a real insight and what the power of podcast also. And even though I've not spent much time, I think I've spent a couple of, I think overall I spent 2.5, 3 months, and I was mostly recording on the weekends. I'm surprised that my podcasts have been listened across 30 countries, and
that's amazing.
I was blown away by that reach.
Yeah, for sure. So since you've been into the podcast scene since October of last year, could you tell us a bit about any trends you see happening in podcasting?
Sure. I mean, the other day I was looking on Twitter, and someone said that everyone used to blog has a Substack, and everyone who has a Substack has a podcast.
Yeah.
So I thought that was funny, and podcast as a trend is picking up. But I think each medium has its own strengths and weaknesses. And with podcasts, the barrier of entry is very low. I mean, me and my friend, when we started our podcast, we spent under $100 to set our podcast, and you would not differentiate our podcast quality between highly produced and scripted content that you see today on Spotify.
Yeah.
In terms of trends, I see firstly the tooling for creators has become incredibly simpler and efficient over the just last couple of years. I mean, with tools like Descript and Otter and usage of machine learning and AI and these technologies had made things incredibly simple. I'll give an example of that, right? So for my first recording of our first episode, I used the software that is part of in Mac, which actually took me to actually compile the episode and put it together. It took me almost 3 hours or so.
Yeah.
And there's a huge learning curve, to set up the mic and record everything. If you're using a Mac and you're trying to set up 2 mics, it was really, I thought it should be much simpler. It's record 2 voices, and editing should also be much simpler. But over the course of that time, I discovered all these tools, Otter AI, Descript AI. They were just coming up and become really famous. And I then started using Descript, which makes editing such a breeze. The editing itself is so easy with these tools that you can produce really high quality content with really no effort.
Yeah.
And I mean, a highly scripted content from these big podcast media houses or to individuals, you would not know the difference. And some of the famous podcasts are just individual creators, whether it being, I mean, the most famous one obviously is Joe Rogan's podcast, and how Spotify acquired it, kind of showing the peak of podcasting perhaps. But even some of other podcasts that I like Invest Like the Best from Patrick O'Shaughnessy, these are all individual podcasts with very little investment, and they can be produced at the same quality level of any production house. So I think in terms of barrier of entry, there's very little barrier of entry, and there is something very personal about a podcast, and the amount of attention span that you can get through podcast is really high. I particularly enjoy listening long form podcasts than short form podcasts. I like conversations which really go deep, that is not otherwise possible even in video, and sometimes, because I think the problem of video usually comes from the fact that, okay, since you're making a video, it has to be produced and it has to be at a certain quality. It has to be certain thing. But even though user-generated content in YouTube has reduced that barrier, video always had that, and perhaps we've broken that with the Joe Rogan's podcast, where you can just sit down and talk, and it could be a video, it could be an audio. So even that barrier of what it means to produce content is changed with podcasts.
Cool.
And last but not the least, podcasts have the advantage of grabbing highest engagement time with the audience, because a podcast can be listened while you're traveling. A podcast can be listened while you're working. A podcast can be listened while you're working out in the gym.
Yeah.
And there's so much attention time. There's only 24 hours to grab for any media business, right? And podcast, I think of it as a media business.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say Netflix has the time. If you think of an average individual, maybe an average individual watches I think it's estimated that an average individual watches about 4 to 6 hours of TV, which is essentially all for, you can think of Netflix addressable market, and even more when you think about it in terms of mobile viewing.
Yeah.
But if you think about podcasting, it's almost like it happens simultaneously with other activities. It's part of like a multitasking thing.
Yeah.
And you have a attention span that you can grab for podcasting is much more.
For sure. So on your end-to-end podcast, Nataraj, you talk a lot about the big businesses like Disney, Netflix, and what they should do. And since you're nominated as a HackerNoon Contributor of the Year for Business Strategy, I thought we could talk about a few companies and their strategies and get your opinion on them. So firstly, could you tell us your advice about what you think Spotify should do next?
I think what any individual or company should do next depends on where they're positioned at, right? Where they're uniquely positioned at, and from which position their current strengths can be compounded. And my particular thesis on Spotify is that they should get into video, because there are a couple of reasons why they should. Firstly, they are the only cross-platform application right now which is reaching all the primary music listening audience out there, especially if you think about North American market.
Yeah.
And they're in a position to reach users irrespective of they're using an Apple device or an Android device, whether they're using, what kind of smartphone they're using. They can also reach into laptops and computers everywhere in the North American market. And now with the entry of video podcasts, because once they acquired Joe Rogan, they are now actually showing video podcasts on their platform. So it's also, I'm kind of extrapolating this from the strength they have. So they have the technology built out, and it's only a matter of time they can introduce user-generated video, and they should start leveraging the existing platform and provide some form of video to their users. And the another reason why they should do it is to provide an alternative to YouTube, because I feel that YouTube is one of the most underutilized platform out there. I think YouTube could do a lot more things that it is not right now doing currently, because even if you see about how YouTube handles their creator side of things, I mean, I think you might be familiar with this company called Patreon, where YouTube creators and all sorts of creators are using Patreon. But in an ideal world, something like Patreon must be created by YouTube. And
for sure.
This only points out to the fact that YouTube is not innovating as much as you would think. Like YouTube, if you put it in China or India, I think it would have been a lot more different than what it is right now. I think YouTube in itself could be a huge platform. And even if it was out of Google and it was an independent company, I think it could have become $1 trillion company already. So my point why Spotify should get into user-generated video or video in any other form is one reason is because YouTube is not innovating. YouTube is not creating more experiences around video. YouTube is not experimenting around video as much as they should. I mean, they've tried these Netflix route of creating their own studio, but they have not otherwise tried different strategies and explore different product improvements that as a user I would want to see. So that's one of the reasons I think why Spotify should get into video business, and I think they're also rightly positioned. They have the reach of the audience. They have a significant amount of paying audience. They are able to reach cross-platform audience. Everything is built out. It's a matter of, and today with the first thought I got about why Spotify is positioned to do video is when I was seeing video ads. And I'm a long-term Spotify user, and at that point itself it clicked to me, why can't I just watch videos inside Spotify when I'm on my desktop?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that would be one of the biggest shifts and biggest value creators if it happens. And I hope it happens as a user. But also it's exciting to have another competitor to YouTube. And I want them to do a user-generated content. And instead of going the Netflix route, which is much more capital intensive, instead they should go with the user-generated content model. And another reason why Spotify should do it is because they're already used to handling creator side of things.
Yes.
Right now, they're already handling music artists, how they are getting paid, how to compensate them. So maybe they have a better way to handle creator side of things too. And that also gives YouTube a little bit of competition, which makes them innovate too.
Yes.
So yeah, that's what I would advise if I was talking to Spotify.
Cool. Yeah. More competition in the video space would be good for everyone, right? It'll open up even more opportunities for content creators. And talking about video content and companies that have been in the headlines regarding video content recently, could you tell us a little bit about what you think TikTok should do next, since they've been running into a bit of trouble recently?
Yeah, TikTok, so in software engineering terms, we always think about a single point of failures. What it means is you never design a system or architecture where you don't have a single point of failure. If you have a database, think of a backup. What happens when this database goes down? Think of what happens this service goes down. We always think about the backup, right? And in geopolitics of running a business, you always have this sovereign risk where the country in which you're operating can meddle with your business operations. And this happens in a lot of non-developed democracies, or in case of China, this is very much true that government can interfere in your business operations. And in US, obviously, you don't expect this to happen, but it did happen. And we are seeing government basically making a deal for TikTok. But in terms of what will happen, I think maybe I would give the chance for TikTok acquisition to happen this year is like less than 20%. If it happens, it will be a coalition of investors. It would include a bunch of very American companies to safeguard the deal, to actually go through. And it will be not one company will hold a bigger stake. I think there will be one or two companies which will hold significant stake, while there will be a bunch of coalition of investors, venture capitalists, and companies which will form. So I wouldn't be even surprised if Walmart, Microsoft, and Oracle, and a bunch of other companies go as investors, because that would make it much more American, because this has become more and more a nationalist issue. So I wouldn't be surprised even if that happened. And that's the only way I could see, even if it happening. If it happens, it will happen with a coalition of investors, with not an individual company. And secondly, what should TikTok do? I think it's not even just TikTok, but any Chinese new company, because TikTok is like one Chinese company which is broken out global. Even though, the roots of it is technically not a Chinese company, because the original product was Musical.ly, which was acquired by ByteDance, and which we now call as TikTok. And TikTok even actually is not existing in China. There's a version of TikTok which exists in China. So TikTok and what exists in China are two separate things anyways. But I think any Chinese company now has to, that single point of failure is that, we have a really sovereign risk which could actually disrupt our whole strategy. And now they have to think about how do we optimize this by separating ourselves from our Chinese roots, which is quite a tough situation to be in. And I think the future companies and future investors, because there are American investors who invested in ByteDance as a company, right, the parent company of TikTok, and even they now start to look at this one-off sovereign risk as a big deal, because now we have made it like sort of a common thing to happen, right? We have set the precedent that this could happen. Before that, it's only in our imagination whether or not it will happen, but now it's a reality. So optimizing for that sovereign risk is going to be a huge factor for both VCs who are investing in China and the new aspirant Chinese companies which are trying to create products globally, that now they are caught up in this situation where, I mean, either of the governments could force them in different directions. And it's definitely a tough position, and they have to try to, both in terms of corporate structure and in terms of building the teams, I think they have to diversify their strategies.
For sure.
Within China and outside China.
Interesting. All right. So talking about global companies, Nataraj, you're also an entrepreneur and investor, and you told me you focus a bit or quite a lot in the startup sector in India. I'm sure this is a topic a lot of us aren't familiar with. Could you tell us a bit about the startup culture and market in India and what you do there?
Sure. So I think we need to, I'll just start with an example of mine. So years now, and since I moved to US, every year I used to visit, I used to go back to India, and whenever I was trying to use local internet, the best I could get was a 2G connection. The mobile internet was not at all usable. And every time I went there, it didn't really change. But around 2017, when I went back to India, all of a sudden, I could access my mobile at a fraction of cost that I could access. Everyone in India was able to access 4G internet on their mobiles flawlessly. And this basically was a seismic shift which changed the face of internet in India. And this is because of a company called Reliance Jio, which was a telecommunications company in India. So if you think about internet, how internet evolved in the US, we went from 1G to 2G to 3G to 4G. Mm-hmm. What happened in India was their option went from straight 2G to 4G. Mm-hmm. So everyone was catapulted to 4G all of a sudden, and 300 million people were accessing internet on 4G and at a fractional cost that you would get in the US. So today, I would dare to say that mobile internet access is in a way a lot cheaper and better in India.
Wow.
Obviously, in certain parts, there's still some rural parts where the connection obviously will not serve. But if you compare like the urban cities, the mobile internet is actually much more accessible for everyone. Like even today, right, some of our AT&T plans are actually costly if you want unlimited internet. But if you compare that with the Indian cost, it's actually fractional of what you pay for in US. You get phenomenal access to internet. And this fundamental fact has changed a lot of things in Indian startup market, right? Because what happens was you couldn't really create, consumer products, consumer-based software products pre-geo effect. And if internet's history would be written, I think you'd have to write a page on just Reliance Jio and what a incredibly seismic shift it has created in Indian internet. That basically gave a platform for entrepreneurs to go out there and build all sorts of things. I think you kind of saw a change and shift in growth in terms of how much startup and entrepreneurship grew after Reliance Jio came into the country. And we've also recently seen how Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and a lot of top private equity firms have invested in Reliance Jio because they understand the power Reliance Jio is bringing in, the incredible amount of services and software stacks they are building and accumulating on their platform. Yeah. So that is one part of the angle why this whole startup ecosystem started to thrive in India. And another thing is, if you also look back, like a couple of decades back, all Indian software companies were mostly service-based companies, where the US companies were outsourcing, or the international companies were outsourcing their services to India, and the companies which were outsourcing had the leverage of monetizing it. They were improving essentially their profit margins by paying in rupee and saving in dollars.
Yes.
But what happened now is since internet is a free medium and it's one of the great equalizing forces, anyone can write software, and India is a very engineering driven society, and there's a lot of youth which are engineers in India, and I being an engineer from India, I mean, the talent is everywhere, right? Even in US or in India. And now all this talent now can create software for the entire world, not just India. Previously, this was not happening, right? Previously, we were creating, the companies outside India were just using India as a place where you can outsource things for cheaper cost. But now the leverage actually shifted towards Indian developers and Indian software companies. So theoretically, my hope is we would see more and more SaaS companies which are created in India and which are accumulating customers all over the world. One good example I can give this of is a product called Postman. Mm-hmm. Postman is essentially a product used by developers to test APIs, and APIs are everything, right? If you're a developer, you're constantly writing APIs, and for the audience, API is programming application interface, right? Yep. So everyone is using APIs to test, and Postman is a tool that is developed in India by Indian developers, and it is right now valued at $2 billion, and it is used all over the world, right? This is one of a classic example, and it's also like a North Star, if you ask me. That is going to be one of the North Stars for me, for what I'm expecting of Indian startup ecosystem to evolve into more and more services and products for not just to India, but also for outside customers. I think that's how India will grow, not just startups, but that's how India should grow, by exporting something. Because if you look at how China has grown, China has exported actual physical things to the entire world, and that's how most of its economic prosperity has come from.
For sure.
So the next development in India would not come from exporting hardware. It would come from, I'm hoping it would come from software.
For sure.
And we are seeing that trends. And if you look at companies like Postman, and there's another company called Zoho, which is like creating a productivity suite, which might compete eventually with Microsoft. So it is not, inconceivable now. And I have much more, bigger ambitions of what I'm expecting from India's startup ecosystem.
For sure. It's really interesting points you bring up, because for sure, without 4G, lots of the startups that we have today wouldn't be possible. Lots of the big companies we have today wouldn't be possible. Things like Uber, these companies that rely on crowd-based workers, that everybody needs to have a mobile phone with a good connection. All of that wouldn't be possible. So now that when you bring in 4G, the possibilities just grow by like 10x, right?
And also the fact that we have, programming and building on cloud also changed things. Right now, you can sitting in India, you can use AWS, Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure, and you can now use technology to scale your product worldwide. Right, even that also brought in another factor through which products can be scaled world over. So it's multiple factors coming together, but it's the timing right now, I think, is where it's at a critical stage where it has to evolve into exporting software to the outside world.
Yes.
And I'm pretty bullish on the possibility for that to happen.
Yeah, exporting software as well, that you just have a higher margin and it's way easier to reach rather than exporting physical goods, right?
Yeah.
So you talked a lot there about, the growth of the global economy, or the economy around India. And you also said you came to the US, I think it was 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So you've been living and working in the US for 8 years. But before this podcast, you said that there are quite a bit of immigration issues that you've seen in the US. And this is a really interesting topic that people in Canada, I'm originally Canadian, we don't really hear much about it. And we definitely don't hear much about it in Japan. Could you tell us a bit about what immigration issues you were referring to and what the problem is right now?
I think the problem, is very specific to Indian immigrants, and this is also faced by a little bit of Chinese immigrants. And the problem is because the way H-1B system is devised, it's essentially, obviously, there are much more Indians who have immigrated legally to India, and heavily into engineering, into the fields of engineering and science. And they're all competing to the same H-1B visas, and they're also on the path towards green cards. But there's an important caveat that is different for Indians slash Chinese versus the rest of the world is the green cards allocated to immigrants on an yearly basis is capped to the 7% of overall allocation. So let's say you have 100 green cards to distribute. You can only distribute 7 green cards for people from Indian origin. So what happens is, but if you compare that with a country or like to Hong Kong or let's say Brazil, and let's say there are 10 people immigrating to US from Brazil, and there are like 50 people immigrating from India to US. So out of the 10 people that have immigrated, 7 people will get the green card this year. And out of the 50 people that have legally immigrated to US from India, only 7 people will get. So the rest of the 43 are basically waiting for next year.
Yes.
But in the next year, there are also 100 more coming from India. So what you have is by year 2, you have 100 from this year and the other 93 from the last year. And you've created this backlog of people who are waiting in the pipeline to get their time, they get their due in the line to get the green card. So what we end up is in a situation where I think millions of people waiting in the green card line for years. And I've heard the statistic is now some people might take as long as 100 years to get a green card.
That's insane. So like this is something that a lot of people don't know about, and it's when I heard about it from you, it sounds incredibly crazy. Like what you're saying then is the way the green card system works, I guess America has deals with certain countries and they will allocate a percentage of the green cards they can give out based on those deals that they've made with those countries.
I don't think it's deals. I think it's just the regulation when it made like it has a cap per country cap, because I think the origin of the rule which as drove the H-1B visa, I think had this cap of 7% to each country. It's not like a deal basis. It's the regulation was part of the the original formulation, and it had like a 7% per country, but no one thought through it, or they might have thought through it, but then we've given more visas to Indians or more people from India came here, and legally, of course, obviously there are problems with other side of these problems like visa abuse and etc. being there. But even if you remove all those factors, you'll still end up with 20 or 30 years of waiting line for a green card.
So when you have a lot of those people waiting in line for a green card, is it a first come, first serve basis, or do they have a bunch of things that they base it on, like how long you've been in the country, what your career is? Do you know what they base it on?
I mean, H-1B is a high-skilled immigrant visa, right? So there are obviously restrictions whether or not you'll get H-1B based on what you have studied and where you're working. And it's very much tied to in what sector and what company is sponsoring your visa.
Okay.
But once you're in the green card process of the once your company has applied a green card for you, you're very much in the first come first serve basis.
I see. And you've been waiting so far for 8 years, but I'm sure you know people that have been waiting longer than that.
Yeah, I've known colleagues, I've known, friends of friends who have been a long time. You go to any company and, top 4 companies, the FANG companies, and you ask around anyone who knows an Indian colleague, they will definitely know this.
Yeah,
I'm just surprised that how often the media doesn't talk about this.
Yeah, well, of course the media is focusing on Mexican immigrants now because of everything Trump's doing, but it's just mind-blowing to me, because in Canada, it's really not like that. It's a lot easier, it's a lot smoother, especially if you have a skilled trade. So the thought to me that somebody could be working in a company like Microsoft for 8 years or however long you've been working there and still not be afforded the opportunity to get a green card is really mind-blowing.
Yeah, I think Canada is using the situation to its advantage. I've known a couple of my friends who've started thinking to move to Canada because of this issue, because they don't see a realistic path to green card. And Canada actually is advertising their visa process heavily in Bay Area and in Seattle and other tech hubs in the US, and they're trying to get more and more individuals who are especially in tech, and their process is much more simpler and easier. And a lot of people I know have a backup plan to move to Canada because of how long it takes to become a citizen in the US.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really big problem that I'm sure the country has lots of problems right now, so they need to focus on the fires that are burning, but this is a really big problem that needs to be addressed some way.
Yeah. I mean, everyone agrees that something has to be done, but no one really knows how to do it and who should do it.
Well, Canada's a big country, so I recommend everyone just go there.
Yeah, it's for sure my backup.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's a bit colder than what you'll be used to, but you can find some good places. Cool. Well, thanks very much for your time, Nataraj. Before we go today, you said one of your biggest hobbies was reading, and you get a lot of value from reading. Before we go, could you tell us what your biggest book recommendations are? I know we did a whole piece about how you should find your own recommendations and the push versus pull life, but based on everything we've talked about today, or just what you've been reading recently, what are some books on either business strategy or podcasting or software engineering that you highly recommend to our listeners?
One of the recent books I'm reading and I would recommend is a book called Priceless, The Myth of Fair Value. It's a very interesting book. It's also in the genre of understanding both business as well as understanding the psychology between a lot of things that we as consumers do and how the pricing behind products actually works. It's a very interesting read. It falls in the genre of business and also psychology. It's by an author called William Poundstone. Another book I'm reading is primarily focused on Indian economy, and it's a book called Bad Money by Vivek Kaul. It's very much focused on the non-performing assets fiasco that's happening in Indian economy. It's a very fascinating and detailed read if you're interested in that sort of thing.
Cool.
Yeah, otherwise I have a bunch of books that I've started and not been actively reading, which you can find on my Goodreads profile. So I actively update my Goodreads profile because it's the thing that I do for myself so that I don't lose track of. But yeah, you can go and find my Goodreads profile.
Beautiful. And our listeners can find you on HackerNoon, obviously, and you're also on LinkedIn. Where else can they find you on social media, and where can they find the End-to-End podcast?
I'm very active on, I think you can easily find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. And you can listen to the podcast end-to-end every major platform where you can find a podcast. It's on Spotify, it's on iTunes, it's on Stitcher, it's on Anchor, it's everywhere.
Perfect. And we'll have links to Nataraj's social profiles in the show notes, as well as links to the End-to-End podcast. So please check those show notes out and listen to his podcast. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Nataraj. This was really fun and really interesting.
Thank you, Limarc. It was fun talking to you. And I hope HackerNoon thrives as both an investor and a contributor.
Thanks very much. I look forward to reading your next story. Thank you for watching another HackerNoon podcast. This was the final segment of our 3-part podcast with Nataraj. If you liked what you heard today, please like and subscribe for more future podcasts. Also, please take a look at the show notes for links to Nataraj's work and social media profiles. Thanks and see you next time.